my pleasure to give the stage to Jacob. He's going to give you an overview of the new department, some of those opportunities. We'll do some short Q&A, and then we'll get into the rest of it. So thanks very much, Jacob Ward.
Thank you, Christopher. Good morning, everyone. As Christopher alluded to, I have a brand new title in the Department of Energy. My name is Jacob Ward, and I am a Supply Chain Deployment Manager. It is my 8th day on the job. Happy to be here, but really underscores, I think, the newness in DOE's thinking about supply chains, about logistics, about the intersection of our country's priorities in the energy sector and in the logistics sector. And I'll touch on that theme in many different ways as part of this opening talk this morning. I also want to underscore, and I will underscore it again as part of this talk, the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains is also brand new. So I'm here representing a part of the Department of Energy that didn't even exist a year ago. So great to see so many faces in the audience today, especially on the heels of what I know has been a difficult couple years. We still have quite a few challenges ahead of us, and I think linking our communities, the energy sector, and all of you as logistics experts to rise to tackle these challenges going forward can be a useful framing, I hope, for the proceedings today. So, energizing sustainable supply chains, pun very much intended. Okay, so we'll do this in 3 parts. First, advancing sustainability in transportation and supporting infrastructure, strengthening and securing energy supply chains to modernize the nation's energy infrastructure and support the clean energy transition, and recent congressional action and the road ahead, what that might mean for all of you. The bipartisan infrastructure law, the bill, if you will, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. Okay, so transportation decarbonization. Logistics matters. Automotive logistics is near and dear to my heart. I am new to the Department of Energy in my current role, but I have served for over 15 years now with the department, previously in their Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. So what better, as Christopher knows, who better to talk to you about the intersection of decarbonization and logistics than someone who has had a foot in both parts of the department. So for 15 years, I worked on transportation decarbonization, and momentum is in the right direction. It's a very exciting time for decarbonization in transportation. And that matters because transportation has grown to be the largest source of carbon emissions in the United States. More than industry, more than commerce, more than electricity generation even. You can see that in the pie chart there on the right-hand side. Emissions aren't the only problem. Transportation is responsible for 50% of energy expenditures and local pollution, air quality. The climate crisis requires rapid, widespread, and major transformations of many complex systems. Transportation itself is already a system of systems, and so addressing all transportation systems really is the only path forward. So strategies. How do we think about greenhouse gas emissions? How do we think about energy expenditures? How do we think about air pollution? Where is this coming from in transportation? So at the top you see a simple equation. I won't make you do math, there's no test at the end here, but it is a useful framework. So emissions are a function of activity, energy intensity, and carbon intensity. And we can think about those one at a time to identify energy solutions that get us to a lower carbon future. So starting on the right and moving to the left, so carbon intensity. This is decarbonizing fuels. Thinking about low-carbon electricity, low-carbon hydrogen, and low-carbon biosourced fuels. Many of those are even domestic resources. Energy intensity, so this is increasing efficiency in the operation of vehicles, light vehicles, heavy vehicles, marine, rail, aviation. And on the left-hand side, of particular interest, I think, to the audience today, and of new interest, I would say, compared to where DOE has invested historically, activity. So system-level design solutions. How can we move people and goods more efficiently with efficient equipment and low-carbon fuel in a way that we efficiently solve this equation at the top? It's a big challenge, and it's going to take both of our communities working together to do that. Okay, multiple solutions needed. So thinking about light vehicles, I'm sure all of you are plugged in, again, pun intended, to the headlines on light vehicles. Lots of support going to electrifying light vehicles, particularly here in Detroit. I was excited, actually riding the People Mover, walking over today, seeing charging stations, curbside, and then parking garages, quite a few different electric vehicles driving around town. Lots of potential for electrifying light vehicles and using low-carbon electricity to decarbonize that part of transportation. But electricity isn't necessarily a solution for all parts of transportation. So leveraging hydrogen and biofuels for other sectors can be valuable. For line haul trucks, clean hydrogen and supporting infrastructure can help move freight across the country with zero carbon emissions. Biofuels, I did fly here. I didn't fly here in a zero carbon fashion, but maybe in a near-term future I can with sustainable aviation fuel that's bio-derived from domestic sources. DOE is focusing on delivering these solutions incrementally. So how do we continue to move forward, decarbonize generation after generation in a way that by 2030, we're halfway there, and by 2050, we are net zero carbon economy-wide? Okay, jumping back to the comments about electrifying light vehicles. So the Department of Energy launched recently the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. This is exciting. All of you are logistics experts. I'm sure some of you have worked with the federal government before. Federal logistics across agencies can be interesting, to say the least. So the fact that we successfully launched a joint office that represents 2 cabinet-level agencies is a big deal. This office is up and running. We announced a new director of that office just yesterday, so that news is hot off the presses. And this is the part of DOE and DOT responsible for $7.5 billion in support for charging infrastructure. So $5 billion for investment along corridors in our national highway system, another $2.5 billion for community charging off the highway system in cities, rural areas, to make sure that all Americans have equitable access to charging anywhere in the United States. This office will also manage grants for electrifying transit and school buses. DriveElectric.gov is the domain for more information. I encourage you to check it out. I think 35 of the 50 state plans for charging infrastructure was posted just in the last week. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, electrification is part but not all of the solution. So what do we do for the rest of transportation? So Supertruck 3, the hero to save the day for the parts of freight, line haul freight that can be electrified. So over $120 million there to explore development and demonstration of electric technologies for heavy trucks, and complementing that with investment, again, in hydrogen and biofuel technologies. So the hydrogen shot is a goal within the next decade. So 1 decade, the goal is to reduce the cost of 1 kilogram of hydrogen to $1. That would significantly reduce costs. If you haven't heard of that hydrogen shot yet, start thinking about a hydrogen future for your equipment and your logistics chains. Off-road maritime rail and aviation, again, SAF and sustainable aviation fuels. So using domestic bio-derived sources for drop-in hydrocarbon replacements would be huge. Several technology challenges to overcome there, but lots of investment to make it happen. Okay, so what does all this mean in terms of cradle-to-grave carbon emissions analysis? I talked to you about electrification, about hydrogen, about biofuels. So what you can see here is a jointly authored study that came out earlier this year by the department, as well as several of our industry colleagues here in Detroit and elsewhere in the US, including GM, Ford, and DTE, the local utility. And so what we see here is starting on the upper left-hand side of this chart, moving to the lower right-hand side. On the y-axis, we're looking at carbon emissions. On the x-axis, we're looking at different families of technology solutions. So vehicle fuel pathways for potential decarbonization here for a small SUV, but you can think of proportional reductions in other parts of transportation. So the black bars show you where we are today. Lots of greenhouse gas emissions compared to where we could be. The red bar shows us where we can get, focusing just on vehicle efficiency. So just changing what's under the hood or the equivalent in other transportation modes. The gray bars show you how much further you can get when you also decarbonize the fuel, but note you don't get all the way to the bottom, right? So those blue bars show you If you don't decarbonize at a system level, if you don't decarbonize vehicle production, if you don't decarbonize the logistics and supply chain leading to the equipment that moves America's economy, you still have significant non-zero carbon emissions. And note, importantly, the proportion of emissions coming from vehicle production and the underlying processes increases proportionally as you decarbonize the other pieces. So today, the vehicle production burden, carbon-wise, of a conventional vehicle, of a battery vehicle, is between 10 to 25%. In a low-carbon future, if we don't focus system-wide, that supply chain, that vehicle production portion rises to as high as 50 to 90%. So the Department of Energy is happy to be here, happy to, I won't say start this conversation, I would say broaden the conversation, recognizing lots of good work is already going on, and we are ready to help build the dialogue in ways that can be constructive for all of us. Decarbonizing is only part of the broader approach. So decarbonization is certainly a priority of this administration, but also meeting everyone's needs, reliable mobility solutions for all. Affordability for all of us. I'm happy to see those gas prices finally falling at the pump, but even better in the future, we won't have to worry about them. And environmental quality tied to affordability. Decoupling automotive logistics from dependency on potentially imported hydrocarbons really ticks all three of those boxes. Okay, hot off the presses, here in Detroit at the auto show last week, the Department of Energy, in conjunction with the Department of Transportation, Housing, Urban Development, and Environmental Protection Agency, announced a new MOU, so just down the street across town, committing all four agencies to work together on an interagency strategy for decarbonization. So when I talk about DOE broadening its focus beyond just the vehicle, beyond the fuel, to the system, we're really putting our MOU in this case, and eventually our money, where our mouths are, working across the government, two parts of the federal cabinet, thinking about other pieces of the system. So housing and urban development, making sure our built environment has the energy infrastructure to support our vehicles, moving people and goods, working with DOT and EPA to make sure that our roads and our water and air quality all are improving in tandem. So look forward to a comprehensive blueprint issued by those four agencies to come out in the next 3 months. Okay, so switching gears from kind of the motivation for this talk, that real imperative to decarbonize, improve air quality, improve affordability and access to mobility for all Americans. How do we do that efficiently? So strengthening and securing energy supply chains. Okay, so February 2021, the president issued an executive order asking for a review of America's critical supply chains. So 100 days later, a first round of 100-day reports came out, and a year later, in February 2022, we had 14 reports on the energy sector supply chains, including 13 issue-specific deep dives that you see reflected here. So carbon capture, electric grid, I'll call out in particular for this crowd, energy storage, fuel cells and electrolyzers, and semiconductors. I think all of these can be of interest, but those in particular probably relevant for automotive logistics. All of these are published online. I'd encourage you to visit all of them of interest. But I in particular want to call out, wait a second, there's 14 reports. There's only 13 issue-specific deep dives. What is 14? So for any Lord of the Rings fans out there, there's the one ring to rule them all. We have the one report to rule them all, which is a very federal thing to do. But we do have a report on reports, and it is very valuable. So America's strategy to secure the supply chain for a robust, clean energy transition, check it out. Really cool document, 62 policy recommendations for how to improve America's supply chains across these 13 technology areas in a systems perspective, right? We don't want recommendations for each of the 13 supply chains separately. We want a holistic approach. And so that 14th report tries to do that. Does that, in fact. So lays out dozens of critical strategies and actions, and is part of a larger whole-of-government approach on supply chains that is shaping the priorities for my office and our sister offices elsewhere in DOE and the federal government. Okay, so as a function of those recommendations, at least partly, the Department of Energy underwent a reorganization earlier this year in order to be able to implement the $62 billion that is coming to DOE just as a function of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So not including the CHIPS Act and not including the Inflation Reduction Act. So our Undersecretary for Science and Innovation will continue the projects that DOE already had underway on energy technology research and development, R&D. The new Office of the Undersecretary for Infrastructure is now going to be responsible for demonstration and deployment, D&D, for near future and next generation clean energy technologies. So that is where my office is housed, the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chain. You can see that highlighted at the bottom right of the slide, responsible for ensuring the energy sector industrial base, ESIB, is supported by a clean, resilient domestic supply chain. And to underscore what a big change this is, it wouldn't be a federal presentation if I didn't have an org chart in here, right? So highlighted at the top of your screen, we have the Office of the Secretary, so that's Jennifer Granholm. Directly beneath her, we have the Office of the Undersecretary for Infrastructure. So when I say new office, this isn't just a new box on the org chart. This is an entire new vertical column. So DOE is taking this very seriously. This is a very big deal. Supply chains are big business in America. DOE is ready to help catalyze supply chains in a way that make them domestic, secure, resilient, and strong for the long term. Okay, so MESC, MESC, the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains. So this is my new office, again, day 8 on the job, responsible for strengthening and securing manufacturing and energy supply chains. So we have 2 focus areas that really are on the now, and then 2 focus areas that are on where is America going. So the first 2 of these are conversations we're having right now. So catalyzing the development of an energy sector industrial base. So recognizing all that's relevant for the energy sector and all the industries that feed into it that affect those supply chains. So what does that system boundary look like? Who are the key players and how do we help that system function efficiently? That includes, in bullet 2, engaging beyond DOE, private sector companies, other federal agencies, and key stakeholders, meaning many of you. Looking forward, we'll be developing, launching, and managing programs to develop clean domestic manufacturing and workforce capabilities. So making sure the energy sector industrial base of today grows into a more secure, more resilient energy sector industrial base tomorrow. And then coordinating with other parts of DOE, like the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, on the management of major demonstration projects across all of DOE's programs. So doing that in a way that's cognizant of, aware of, and listening to that energy sector industrial base. Okay, we have 3 program areas so far. Facility and workforce assistance, addressing building, converting facilities in a way that make them robust, resilient, secure, and use domestic supplies in as much as possible, and building the workforce, the domestic workforce, to actually operate this energy sector industrial base. Battery and critical materials of special interest for us, especially at an automotive logistics conference, because there's so much opportunity to be unlocked with mobile energy storage in terms of decarbonizing transportation, like we already talked about, but also using domestic resources, using domestic labor, and again, the energy sector industrial base, understanding what that system looks like and helping it operate efficiently. I want to recognize, and hopefully this goes without saying, but it's important to make explicit. Our office is new. We are very well aware that good work is already going on in this space. So we understand we are not inventing this. We are coming to the table and ready to be part of the conversation. And I say that not only because many of you are already doing good work in this space, but we want to acknowledge that we are building on good work already done elsewhere by DOE, by other agencies, and by the private sector. So before our office came into being, the department published, with input from the private sector, the National Blueprint for Lithium Batteries. The idea being that by 2030, the US and its partners will establish a secure battery materials and technology supply chain to support long-term US economic competitiveness, job creation, decarbonization, and national security. And so you can see the 5 goals articulated in that blueprint align with 5 parts of the battery supply chain. And so to underscore, in terms of a specific example of the processes that our office is standing up, understanding supply chains for the automotive sector, but also more broadly, let's dive into that. So here's an example of mapping out the lithium-ion battery supply chain. So starting with critical materials on the left-hand side, moving through, putting those materials together into subcomponents and components, building those into devices, and even looking at end uses, right? Not just looking at the final products, but understand how they're being used. Is that the most efficient use of those devices? Can we get at that in another way from a systems framework? And by putting this framework together, we can see overarching considerations emerge, questions relevant for DOE to ask of itself, to ask of our sister agencies, and to ask of our private sector partners. So what considerations do we have for costs, for logistics, for equity, for access, for bottlenecks, and for resilience? Okay, in another map, if you will, we can look at the same flow, but instead of just a process flow, now we're looking at volume of materials on the left-hand side, of refined materials in the middle, of some components also in the middle, to final products on the right-hand side. Note that our focus here, a relevant focus for an automotive logistics conference, is electric vehicles. And so we're starting with raw lithium on the left-hand side, we're refining that, we're producing it into EV components. But note, keeping the systems framework in mind, it's a healthy reminder that we are not the only ones active in this space, right? Our supply chains are intertwined, they're feeding multiple end uses, and this diagram, for someone who was an EV guy 2 weeks ago, is now a supply chain guy. This is a really important figure, understanding that 2/3 of global lithium is going to end uses that is not electric vehicles. I mean, all of those end uses are important. So how do we think about balancing those end uses, balancing the supply chain from those end uses back to critical materials, critical minerals, in a way that keeps the supply chain flowing, secure, and resilient? Okay, and then using these frameworks to identify potential bottlenecks or the trickiest touch points in the supply chain. So looking here at the intersection of potential supply disruption on the left-hand side, supply risk on the right-hand side, looking at the product of those in a qualitative measure to understand what rises to the top being the upper right-hand side here, to understand where we should devote resources to be efficient with DOE investment to address the highest risk, highest impact disruptions, potential disruptions, I should say, first. Okay, so lots going on in decarbonization, lots going on in supply chain. What has happened in the past year? Arguably the most important part of this presentation. Lots of opportunity for all of you and lots of activity at DOE. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law really motivated, I think, the fact that I can be here today. My office wouldn't exist without it. So a total of $7 billion going to batteries. $3 billion of that was announced earlier this year, so the solicitation is out and open. Some of you may have applied, so I actually can't talk about it in detail, but we're looking forward to, I think, evaluating proposals and having selections in the relatively near future. I'm really looking forward to deploying that $3 billion to invest here in the US to start to bring some of those battery manufacturing and supply chains back on shore. So as I mentioned, $7 billion in the battery supply chain over the next 5 years, from sustainable sourcing all the way through the battery life cycle to end-of-life battery collection and recycling. Other provisions aimed at electric vehicle charging. I mentioned the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation earlier, which is managing $7.5 billion in charging grants that will be administered by the states. $5 billion for the highway system, $2.5 billion for communities. Okay, wanted to show you, since we've talked quite a bit about batteries already, how the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was written very intentionally in a way that maps back to that supply chain. So taking the supply chain that we saw on the horizontal axis a few slides ago, we're now looking at on the vertical axis, from upstream raw materials production through midstream subcomponent and component production to downstream pack manufacturing and circular economy, thinking of the whole end of life, so collection, decommissioning, and recycling where we can, and looking at several provisions in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law on the right-hand side, and look how nicely they address each of those. For 40207B, battery material processing grants, so helping that midstream, early midstream. 40207C, manufacturing and recycling grants, so moving from midstream through final product to end-of-life recycling and reuse. And it's not just getting those batteries, but wanted to underscore on the next slide, sustainability is key here, right? So getting the amount of critical materials we need is going to be, it's going to take some effort, right? There will be some growing pains as we settle into kind of a new normal in terms of supply chains. But once we get there, we can continue to operate them efficiently if we're responsible with what we have, right? So triple underscore on sustainability and looking at two approaches to ensuring that the material that goes into batteries stays available to go into other batteries or other end uses here in the United States. So 40207, thinking about reverse logistics, so thinking about how people are using the batteries, what they do with end of life, opportunity for second use and recycling, and actually making it easy for people to do that. On the right-hand side, 40208, combining improvements in batteries and critical materials with opportunities to keep those in the supply chain. Again, from end of life back to beginning, either critical material or subcomponent. Okay, CHIPS, creating helpful incentives to produce Semiconductors Act. So this was a follow-on to the bipartisan infrastructure law, came out earlier this summer, designed to boost American semiconductor research and production and unlock hundreds of billions in private investment. Much of that has already started to happen. So just in the past few months, we've had major announcements. Micron announced $40 billion in memory chip manufacturing, and Qualcomm is going to ramp up semiconductor production by 50% over the next 5 years. Those are in addition to the $1 billion directly focused on deploying wireless technologies to help the wireless supply chain. So think about all you could do if you had a more efficient wireless system to share information about how your supply chain is operating. Those funds are or will be available to help make that happen. And then finally, the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, the latest, I think, feather in this supply chain and logistics cap, if you will. Lots of provisions to support domestic material sourcing and battery production. So they take the form of grants, credits, and direct purchase. So grants, we have $2 billion that will be available in domestic manufacturing conversion grants. So that's taking existing domestic facilities, retooling them, preparing them to manufacture electric and other low-carbon vehicles. There's another $3 billion in credit subsidies through the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Program, through DOE's Loan Programs Office. In addition to that, 2 tax credits worth mentioning, the Advanced Manufacturing Production Tax Credit and the Advanced Energy Projects Investment Credit, as well as a direct purchase provision, $3 billion allocated to the U.S. Postal Service in an important market signal. That $3 billion is devoted to helping the United States Postal Service go electric and helping the federal government lead by example. Okay, so all this taken together, a cool chart here on the right-hand side that shows the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and DPA is the Defense Production Act, which actually has allocated $500 million in addition to what Bill and IRA provide for critical material and mineral concerns. And you can see how the legislation works together to complement one another across the battery supply chain here. Okay, so with that, we started out talking about advancing sustainability, how there's a motivation and that pressure to decarbonize transportation for America's near-term and long-term future. We talked about strengthening and securing energy supply chains, this nexus of energy and supply chains, and the fact that our communities are having a handshake, ready to learn from one another and expand the dialogue, and how we can do all of these things effectively and efficiently. Efficiently, I know, is a favorite word of this community, together. And then what has changed in the past year? So recent congressional action, what the bill, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act might mean for all of you. Thank you for letting me be here. Special thanks to Christopher for organizing the event, to all the organizers. I have some time for questions, and then again, my email is on the first slide. Please be in touch with ideas, questions, concerns. We would love to hear from and work with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacob. Here we go. Thank you so much. Just to reiterate, I know that maybe, depending on where you're sat in the room, it might not have been easy to see. The slides will be available. We're actually in the process of uploading them to the event app. I'll give you some details about that afterwards. So we'll make sure that you all get this information, and obviously the opportunity to connect with Jacob and his office. We've got a couple of minutes for questions before we move to our other session. Jacob, one point I want to pick up on. Now, clearly, the focus on strengthening our supply chains in America, and that is key. There's no question about that, and obviously the raison d'etre of many points of this talk and this office. But we know there's gaps. When we look at the battery supply chain right now, there's no secret of who's ahead and who's a bit behind in that. And so trade partners are also going to play a key role in this too. And in the logistics community, that's also a key point as well. So can you just talk a little bit about how that is seen from the government and DOE side in terms of working with important trade partners in this ramp up as well?
Absolutely. It's a really good question, Christopher. So I think it was evident in the slides, it's evident in the legislation. American-led, American-made is a priority. And to the extent we can leverage domestic resources we want to, we are constrained by what those domestic resources are, right? So if we don't have those critical minerals within our borders, you're exactly right. It is critical to work with trade partners to help make those supply chains secure and resilient for all of us, not just the United States, but all of those trade partners. I know last week, earlier this month, the president issued actually a presidential order looking at exploring potential unfriendly foreign investment in our critical supply chains. And so I think that's helping inform friendshoring is a phrase that I've started hearing get thrown around, and that may become a strategy. Won't speak for official foreign policy, but certainly is a pragmatic path forward.
This is the latest social network trend, is friendshoring. When we talk about shifting to sustainable supply chains, it's interesting because there's a potential that the fast movers could lose some competitiveness in the very short term if you think about the investment or switching to certain types of renewables. Is that sort of part of the policy framework as well to help and support faster movers into some of these areas?
Yeah, you're taking the answer taking the words out of my mouth, Christopher. I like the way you think. So I get that. It's a good question. I think historically and prior to the current policy paradigm in which we find ourselves, there might have been some who saw competitiveness and jobs as intention. I don't think that's necessarily true today, certainly not as true today, because these resources are available. So certainly available to help the fast movers leverage, catalyze change to this new normal, this future state where competitiveness and domestic job growth can be symbiotic, actually.
Yeah, it would be exciting. So we'd be excited to see more of that hydrogen equipment and stuff coming in faster, but we know that in some cases it's hard for some companies to jump onto that quickly.
Absolutely.
You spoke in the beginning, it's been a part of your role, I believe, at the Vehicle Technologies Office for some time in terms of the end-to-end cradle-to-grave real analysis. I know you're only day 8 into the job being a supply chain expert now, but do you think there has been enough emphasis up to now on the role of logistics and freight in that end-to-end analysis as well?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair question. It's a good question. I think the primary focus areas for the Vehicle Technologies Office for energy efficiency and renewable energy historically have been on the vehicle itself and the fuel. So decarbonize those. I think part of that research has led to the discovery that the systems framing matters, the logistics matter, decarbonizing upstream also matters. And I think as the results even that I showed, that piece of the puzzle becomes a bigger and bigger deal the longer it's ignored. So I think it's part of the conversation now. It's a new part for us, recognizing it's not a new part for you. We have a lot to learn, and we're looking forward to learning.
Absolutely, and we take up on that point on the freight sector in terms of securing sustainable energy supply chains, alternative fuels, for example. Can you give us some insights into how the department may be focused on accessing and increasing supply for things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I did focus heavily on battery supply chains, I understand. Lots of excitement, lots of opportunity there. But electrifying light vehicles is only one part of the sector. And I know I only touched on this briefly, so thank you for the opportunity to expand. So lots of promise also offered by another energy carrier, hydrogen. So anywhere electrification might not work, and electrification is more than light vehicles. So ports, for example, port equipment, drayage trucks, transit buses, school buses, lots of opportunity promise there for electrification. But beyond that, line haul, heavy trucks, for example, hydrogen can be promising there. And then bio-derived hydrocarbons, really, really exciting because they're domestically sourced. You can use them in planes, you can use them in ships, you can use them in off and non-road equipment. And so I think there are technology pathways that can help us tick all the right boxes in transportation. And I think continuing investment across those technology pipelines will continue and is important.
You noted it, you said it's a big deal, and I noted the collaboration of the new joint office, the communication between the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation. Perhaps a side note as well that Michigan and Detroit is also obviously familiar territory for the Secretary Granholm as well. How important is this for you and for your department that this collaboration, communication with the Department of Transportation?
Yeah, so I'll say again, it is a big deal. I want to add, of course, DOT, EPA, Department of Energy, de facto on an ad hoc basis have collaborated well for a long time. I think formalizing the collaboration between Department of Energy and Department of Transportation is important because it sends a broad signal, so that's important. But internally, it increases efficiency. We can do things more effectively as the federal government because we're not sending paperwork back and forth. It's the same thing. And it is a go-to office. So there are specific responsibilities assigned to that office, but it becomes the foundation on which other collaborations can be built. So it's a time-limited office, technically 5 years, but I think the community that is built in it and around it, I think become the foundation for longer-term, effective, efficient collaboration.
Exciting. So maybe is there an audience question that we want to take? Otherwise, I have a last one. Is that a hand in the back, or is that someone? Yeah, is that a hand back there? Or is that, yeah, please, can we get a mic over there? Just say your name and company, please.
Hazel Southwell, Automotive Logistics. You've spoken a lot about lithium, understandably, because it's currently the best battery technology that we have. But in terms of other parts of the Department of Energy that are looking into research about other battery technologies, about new technologies coming through, how much will you be collaborating with the industry and kind of communicating potential for those kind of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, admittedly, the talk today was focused on this new office and the intersection of energy and supply chain, so very near-term technologies, of which lithium-ion certainly is a promising one. DOE and the broader federal research enterprise and private research enterprise is looking for next-generation lithium and beyond technologies, lithium air, lithium metal, looking at improving cyclability, safety, and other features of those. But long-term energy storage is also relevant there. So all of that is in the broader DOE portfolio, the National Science Foundation portfolio, and so lots of work going on there. So it's not just lithium-ion. I'm looking forward to pushing those out as soon as possible for higher energy density, lower cost, and overall efficiency.
Fantastic. Maybe just a last question, Jacob. Day 8 in the job, when we invite you back here next year in your office to share, what are the key objectives you would have hoped to have achieved and moved towards by then?
Yeah, this is such a good last question. So I want to observe the fact that our office exists is already a big win.
Yeah.
So a year ago we didn't. We have started to staff up. We are pulling a strategic plan together. So the fact that we exist, I think, is great news, and I'm glad to share that today. I think another very close near-term win. So of the $7 billion going to support domestic lithium-ion battery production, $3 billion of selection should be announced in the coming weeks, months. I think that's public knowledge, not saying anything I'm not supposed to, so stay tuned, that will be big news. I think a year from now, this is a logistics crowd, so I would say a year from now, I hope to have gone from strategy to operations. So not just what we plan to do, not just what we know we need to do, but how we're doing it. So thank you for teasing that invite, and I look forward to sharing that next year.
Well, we look forward to sharing it as well. Jacob Ward, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.